Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 33. This is 4.13, Society of the South in the Early Republic. This is the last historical topic before we do a big roundup of the entire historical period. The theme that we're looking at today is geography and the environment. So the learning objective is explain how geographic and environmental factors shaped the developments of the South from 1800 to 1848. And the first thing that we're talking about is how Southern business leaders continued to rely on the production and export of traditional agricultural staples, contributing to the growth of a distinctive Southern regional identity. Now, the agricultural staples that were being grown were rice, tobacco, and later on cotton, with the growth of the cotton industry due to the creation of the cotton gin. All of Southern regional identity was based on this agricultural way of life. There were very few large cities. The largest city in the South before the Civil War was the city of New Orleans, and it was only the fifth largest city in the country. So there were four larger cities in the North. And then all of the other cities in the South, like Charleston and Richmond, they didn't even come close to the numbers of New Orleans or some of the other large northern urban centers. It was still very much agricultural, and the number one crop that people focus on in the South is cotton. So in the South, cotton was king. That's where we get this king cotton phrase. It made up two-thirds of US exports to Britain. So it was economically very important for the United States. And the profits that people got from the cotton encouraged more people to move further out west, to expand their plantations with more land, and also buy more enslaved people to work on the land. In the South, although the majority of Southerners owned no slaves, most leaders argued that slavery was part of the Southern way of life. So in the South, they called slavery the peculiar institution. This was a way to try and hide the evils of slavery, to try and sugarcoat what it was all about. And from the 1800s to the right before the Civil War started in 1860, the enslaved population grew from 1 million to 4 million. So it quadrupled. This is at a time in which the population of the United States is doubling every 25 years. So you see that there is a similar type of natural increase. Despite the barriers that enslaved people had to normal family life. If two enslaved people wanted to get married, they would have to get the permission of the enslaver. Other times, enslaved women were being used to breed more and more enslaved people and bring them into the world. There were times in which an enslaved woman could marry a free man or vice versa, and the birth of the child and the status of the child born out of those marriages would follow the status of the woman based on the Southern slave codes. Now, for the enslavers, 75% of the population did not practice slavery in the South. So a lot of these plantations and agricultural enterprises in the South were mostly, or in the majority, um, worked on by white families who did not practice slavery. Most people who did own people in bondage, most enslavers had less than 20 people in bondage, and then a very small, very wealthy aristocratic class owned the majority of the slaves in the South. But why was it that the South overall was so strong in their support for slavery? Well, the very wealthy aristocratic class was the one that had the most influence in state politics, state governments, and they convinced the rest of the South that this was necessary, that this was something that was part of the South. Those poor whites that were at the very bottom of the social classes, they were always hoping that they could, at some point, attain the type of wealth that the wealthiest classes had done. And if they took slavery away, they would never be able to maintain or attain that kind of wealth. As slavery starts to expand further out west, as people start moving for more and more land, you see that there is a shift of the enslaved population being concentrated in the upper southern states and then moving down to the Mississippi River and that surrounding area. So the map on the bottom right shows the concentration of enslaved people in the year 1860. The darker areas are the ones where you have the highest concentration, and you can see that that's along the Mississippi River, all the areas that planted cotton. On the top left, you see a line graph of the enslaved population as a percentage of the total population across southern states. And you have to look at it closely, but what it shows you is that the percentages in the upper southern states, like Maryland or Delaware, they have a dip in the lines, and then all of these states that are in the deep south or in the southwest, they see an increase of their enslaved populations. So states of like South Carolina, they are kind of on the border between the deep south and the upper south. They see a huge increase because the city of Charleston becomes a center for the slave trade, the internal slave trade. All right, so as overcultivation depleted arable land in the southeast, slaveholders began relocating their plantations to more fertile lands west of the Appalachians, where the institution of slavery continued to grow. So this is exactly what we're talking about. The Southerners are moving out west because they have overcultivated the lands in the upper south or in the southeast. The cotton that they were planting depleted the soil of its nutrients, and they needed to go and find more land that would yield more cotton crops. Those that were moving out west with enslaved people were bound by the Missouri Compromise. So that's the southern boundary of the state of Missouri going all the way out west. By 1845, more southwestern territories added to the Union through the Texas annexation and the Mexican cession that's awarded through the end of the Mexican-American War. But it's unclear how much more land slavery is going to be able to expand into. That's going to be a debate that's going to carry us into the next historical period about how the land inside of the Mexican cession is going to be divided up between slave states and free states. The internal slave trade is continuing to grow. The enslavers of the Upper South would sell their bondsmen south and southwest. This would be done, like I said, in the large cities of the South. Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana, were some of the biggest centers for the slave trade. And in Louisiana in particular, they would be auctioned off in these really grand hotels, these spectacular hotels. On the bottom right, you see a very old picture of the St. Louis Hotel, where they used to have auctions inside of it. And then on the bottom left, you see a picture from a South Carolina slave auction. So the way in which they would be treated, almost like cattle, like animals being auctioned off. All right, and then finally, for our recap, slavery became more ingrained into Southern society in the antebellum in this period. So more and more people are believing that it is part of the way of life, and that if you take slavery away, then you're also in a way trying to kill the Southern society. The South relied heavily on agriculture and cotton plantation. And finally, as Southern farmers moved west, they took their enslaved people with them. All right, that is all for this lecture. We have one more lecture in period 4. That's going to be a recap of everything and looking at causation in period 4. I hope to see you then.